Good evening, everyone. And we have a full house minus the 10 empty chairs, but we thank you for coming out for this celebration of America's 250th anniversary. Freeman's has put on a trifecta of sales. The first here printed in manuscript Americana this week, January 29th. Many items you'll see in this room. And then we're also promoting a sale on March 26th, The Fathers and Saviors of Our Country, which tells the story starting with George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and then we'll end this celebration with the Eric Caron Collection, Part 10, on June 30th. We have this wonderful panel tonight. First on my left, Dr. Philip Mead, historian, curator, collector, and dealer specializing in early America. He was the founding chief historian and director of curatorial affairs at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, where he helped shape the museum's galleries and most recently led its major 250th anniversary exhibition, The Declaration's Journey. He holds a PhD from Harvard and now operates Mead Americana, focusing on early American books, ephemera, and historical objects. In the middle, we have Daniel Weinberg, president and owner of the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, one of the most respected firms in the world for Lincoln and Civil War material. Associated with the shop since 1971 and its sole owner since 1984, he has helped build many of the most important public and private collections and is widely regarded for his expertise in appraisal, authentication, and collection building. At the end, we have my esteemed colleague, Darren Winston, Senior Vice President and Head of Books and Manuscripts Department at Freeman's in Philadelphia. A longtime bookseller and auction specialist, he has worked with private collectors, institutions, and estates for decades. Darren is a trustee of the Rosenbach Museum and Library and an active member of several bibliographical and manuscript organizations. So with that, we'll open up my first question. As we approach the 250th anniversary, interest in early American material feels very strong. From your different vantage points, museum, private trade, and auction, what changes are you seeing right now? And do you think this is an anniversary-driven moment or something more lasting? We'll begin with Darren, with the with the auction vantage point.
Right, I'll try and remember the those order. I think it's both. It's 250th infused moment. Why shouldn't it be? But also, I've noticed I've been in trade for 31 years, been in the auction side 8 years, and I've seen a definite upswing just in the last 8 years. It kind of exploded during COVID, where most of us were either at home looking for our stuff and wanting more, or looking for our stuff and getting rid of it. But it was all filtering through auction houses. Not all, but a lot. And I don't know if the lead up to now was people knowing, wow, the 250th. I remember the 200th. I think I was in kindergarten or first grade. That was a big deal. I don't know if people were looking toward it or just every time there's a great sale, more great material comes out, some more facts and figures get added to the historical record. Sorry, I'm like talking to you and there's a microphone I should be using. I'll just back up there and say that I think that 2026 is a big deal, but we've been seeing great material. Again, just looking at the last 8 years, prices keep building from sale to sale. I think the quality of the material, it's not getting better, it's getting more interesting. And I think every time you unearth or we unearth something special or a consignor does, everyone just goes back and looks at their own material and think, I didn't think that was a value before, now maybe it is. And to drag the internet into it, scholarship has completely changed because we have people like Harold Holtz, our esteemed colleague, who did it with pen and pencil and paper, and now you can jump online and look at 97 different sources in an hour, but still make connections that weren't there before. So I think we benefit from that sort of work, and my colleagues who do most of the cataloging, they find those things every day, and 20 years ago, it might take you a month to find out that someone sat next to someone at a dinner in 1779, and now it's a click away. So I think that helps us on that upswing that I think we're on, and I think I'll pass it over to one of my colleagues because I can't stop talking.
Thank you, Darren. Daniel?
Well, first of all, I think it's getting better because maybe the internet is helping it, but it's certainly different than when I got it in '71, where an auction house, for example, maybe even many of my colleagues in their catalogs would have 2 sentences about something, and that's it, hardly even have a photograph. You have to go out and see it somehow. So I think we're delving more deeply into material that we never used to do, and we're learning a great deal because of that. I have to admit up here that I'm a little jealous of the auction houses because I think they have an upper hand right now, frankly, in finding material, and they get great stuff, and I think it's interesting for us dealers to try to also get great stuff. But I think that fads come and go, and I don't know how long this will last. I think there's always going to be, hopefully, a certain segment of the population who will collect and have the money for it. For a while, it was hard for anyone to get in when some older collectors who are not doing it anymore or they're gone were grabbing everything, and it was then tough for anyone new to come in. Maybe now, especially with thinking of artifacts, and we'll talk maybe about artifacts and ephemera, et cetera, but with that maybe coming up more to the fore and it's more spread out what people collect, that might be of a help.
Well, amen to artifacts coming to the fore. I think that, this fad, if you'd call it that, of Americana has lasted since the mid-19th century. And it's churned and moved and had different rises and falls in emphasis. And it's interesting that in objects, for maybe 20 years, there's been quite a bit of hand-wringing about particularly furniture and the decorative arts and the sort of declining audience in those areas, while I see historical material gaining traction, that is to say, items with a definite original owner or maker, items that intersected with important events or people. And I think the definition of what is historical is also changed and broadened, so that in the museum world, what I see really happening is, I think the popularity of Americana since the mid-19th century has always been driven by the way these items allow us to ask questions and come up with surprising avenues of research into the fundamental issue of what is it to be American. And I think that the items that people are finding resonant with that are becoming more complex, more diverse, more challenging but inspiring, more nuanced, more interesting. I see in both the museum world and in the profile of collecting material a surging power of the fundamental documents. I mean, the prices recently on Declaration of Independence broadsides, for example, has just been, a pace that I don't think has been seen before in a span of several years. But also you have in this sale items that I think reflect a increased interest in the social history value of documents and items, manumission documents from Pennsylvania from 1791 for an enslaved man who's navigating the effects of the Gradual Abolition Act in Pennsylvania of 1780. A 1778 muster roll of a Massachusetts militia regiment that has a black soldier on it. Those types of things, I think, have grown enormously in popularity and interest in the past 20 years. And I think that's because of this continued fascination with those fundamental documents and surging value that they have, but also a broadening idea of who is contributing to those through American history and what it means to be American. So I see a lot of hope in both the museum world and in the collecting world for the answer to that question about America.
I have a question then.
Yeah.
How deep is this, do you think? one of the things that I worry about, literally the humanities.
Yeah.
We all know the humanities are not being taught. So one of the things that I think artifacts do is that it teaches us history because they each have stories.
Right.
And we have to dig down to find out what those stories are.
Right.
And the collector, embedded in his or her community, I think that's where the humanities are going to be taught. You have something you can show a kid in school or at a Rotary, and people get interested that way. So I think it broadens out a bit and brings more people into the collecting world. But if they don't know the eras, they don't know the people, they don't know the events, that could be a red flag for the future.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a huge question. And what you're kind of charting out is that in the absence of the funding we've known and expected in the humanities, that we're returning to early principles like cabinets of curiosities, like the Royal Society being a realm of collecting, and that the practice of collecting, which in my own research into revolutionary soldiers, I found going on among the lowest sorts of people, that is to say, the people with the least financial stability, let's say, of the 18th century. In a hot site I dug with David Starbuck at Rogers Island in a French and Indian War site in New York back in the early 90s, there was a little pile of woodland projectile points that were out of context. These are 1,000-year-old things that some French and Indian War provincial soldier had gathered together whenever he was presumably on sentry duty or whatever. He'd find them on the ground and thought that was interesting. In the 18th century, there is this broad sort of cross-class fascination with collecting, and that proceeds through the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, they had to post guards on Gettysburg battlefield, right, to make sure people weren't going in there and picking up artifacts. And I think that there was a large move in the 20th century to professionalize and institutionalize a lot of that. And I think that, maybe now there is another golden age in the need for those sort of collecting
We see
activities.
so much coming out of the 19th century, really, because as you're saying, and the rise of the middle class helped that as well. A material culture, commerce culture started, and people wanted to have material in their homes
Right.
for memory, for emotional support from the past, and enough material was being made, especially through beginning of the Civil War and after that, and it was material that people wanted to have in their homes. Today, you almost have to have a museum on the side of your home because you're not going to really, like decorative arts you were talking about, they just don't fit in. But yes, some of the things such as the Declaration here or the Washington letter behind you have such good content that anyone would want to get involved if they have a curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah, it's often the familiar documents that are the entry point. The Declaration, it's the language is so obviously resonant and often familiar. Constitution, same Bill of Rights, Gettysburg Address, those, but I think, and it's interesting what's happening in scholarship now on the decorative arts and the three-dimensional items. There's a lot of effort to try to repopulate those things with all the various people in the chain of their creation and survival, and in a sense to turn them into documents. So who made this piece of furniture? Not only the principal master craftsperson who is known to history from the ledgers and whatnot, but who else is working in that shop, and where did they come from, and where are all the inputs on that item? And that, I think, is has yet to really register in the auction and dealing community, but I think it's coming. And I think it's something to pay attention to, both for research and patriotic, let's say, reasons, but also, for financial reasons. There's going to be a lot of discoveries that people are going to make, and those are going to increase the interest in a lot of these items.
Well, it's actually the perfect segue to this next question. How books, manuscripts, and ephemera, they often tell the same moment very different ways. Are there certain types of material being reevaluated or that are underappreciated at the moment?
Underappreciated.
I mean, so ephemera for the longest time, it was, it was just
There's even a
discards.
bias. There was even a bias against ephemera.
Right. And like campaign material, I mean, it was, people had them as keepsakes, but not really as
See, that's
collectibles.
one of the reasons that now I think is broadened, because people can purchase that. I'm talking about money. You can purchase that. Or may not be able to purchase this immediately now, but maybe in the future you make some money. But you can get a campaign token or a silk. And if one buys quality over quantity, which we all remind people to do, I'm sure, it's an entry point, as you say, to higher up.
I think there's, I think something you said about how deep this goes is partly an answer to your question, which is to say, I see there being a surging value in the top end of the market, but the sort of entry-level things are not driven the same way, and I think that's partially because of people, and I think a tier up as well. They're not increasing in value at the same rate. I think that's marks the need for more people in a new, let's call it a generation, but a new group of collectors, and I think there needs to be some way found to encourage that, because otherwise it's
Well, I mean, I'm in a special world, Abraham Lincoln, and it's a little different than everything else. It just keeps going. It's a little engine that keeps going, and it may be if the economy is down, you can't buy things, but then it goes right back up the moment that it gets better. People want that sort of person in their life because they know who he is. That's part of what I was saying too about the humanities. You have to know the humanities to be able to cherish something and put it in. But at the same time, decorative arts, even in campaign material or assassination material. There's a plethora of books, and Harold is doing one right now on 50 objects from a specific collection, and there are numbers of 50 objects from this, 100 objects from that. I think that's something that might really help get people, because they see it on a coffee table and they get interested, I hope, especially young people. So I think the objects are now getting the sort of press that they never did before.
Well, the Revolution occupies a similar place to Lincoln, I think, in that it remains a focus of a broad audience for as people's interests go ebb and flow in other areas. I sense one of the things that is a problem is people believe this stuff is more expensive than it is. That is to say, I'll hear people say, well, something from the Revolution, my God, I can't do that. I'm not a millionaire. It's like, well, this musket ball's $4. This pay voucher from that was actually used to pay a Connecticut soldier who fought through the Revolution, it's $100. That they're noted on the back for 8 years. Well, this person carried it in his wallet, having to go back to Hartford annually to get the interest before it was fully paid down. I mean, you talk about something that was a witness to history from 1782 when these things were issued. I'm talking about, for collectors of Revolutionary paper, you know what I'm talking about, these pay vouchers, they're the most common pieces of Revolutionary paper. They were issued out to the Army as a promissory note when they couldn't pay them fully. And, those things saw the end of the war. They saw the Shays Rebellion. They saw the move to the Constitution before they were finally redeemed in 1789. These were the items that Hamilton and Madison locked horns over about who should be the recipient of their value. Hamilton thought they needed to be redeemed as transferable currency to stabilize the American financial system. That is to say, whoever had it in their hand, that was the owner. Madison thought these were elements of the blood sacrifice made by the soldiery of the Revolution, and they should be redeemed only to the person whose name was on it, because they were all filled out in manuscript. And Hamilton said that's creating an aristocracy, because it's saying that these men who fought have a higher claim on property in the United States than general transfer would demand. You know, that's a little thing. That's $100. That touches on basically the fundamentals of the American nation, from the soldiery that created it to the statesmen who debated who it would be redeemed to all the international debt implications and credit implications of nation founding, to all the people, the people across the country of various positions and backgrounds who were beneficiaries of those notes. I mean, that, to me, is worth every bit of $100.
Yeah.
And I think more people who knew they could hold that in their hand, in their own home, and tell their families this was there for $100. I mean, you know, nowadays it's like 2 Starbucks coffees.
Well, maybe my colleagues and I, dealers, and certainly maybe even auction houses, should have a plethora of lower end at the same time, and then maybe not have, God, I can't put anything below $1,500 into my catalog. I can't afford it.
Yeah.
But you can't afford not to.
Right.
To put things in that will bring people in the first place, and then aspire to something more.
That's right.
Although I tell people that a collection is a collection. It means to you. And I learned, I learned early on, paperbacks are still a collection. Okay, it's not going to be worth anything at the end. When you're gone, it's not worth anything monetarily, but it fed your soul, and it maybe got other people involved. When I first came to the bookshop in '71, there was a man who came in a few times before he just kind of left the scene, a middle-aged black man who came in for FDR material. He wanted books about FDR. And about the second time he came in, I realized he couldn't read. So he wanted to collect his hero and be surrounded by his hero. That was enough for him. And he was collecting in a way.
Yep. Yeah. Bill.
I'm sure Darren can touch on, the auction market, but, Freeman's really prides itself in having things at $200. We sell things at $1 million. We open up these auctions to all walks of life and all collectors, and I'm sure Darren can add to that.
Right. And to the point, particularly what you just said, Phil, I will often take, whether it's a piece of paper or a musket ball, and I'll just put it in someone's hand before I tell them what it is. And then I'll say, that musket ball has been hanging around for 250 years, and think of where it might have come from and who shot it and who they shot it at, and just this idea, the witness to history. I refer to everything here. These are all witnesses to history. That document behind Phil's head, that's a George Washington letter. If it's on my desk at work, or my colleagues, any of us at Freeman's, I look and I think, there's my mail, there's my incoming box, and then there's like George Washington's mail on the other side of my desk. And when I get over how cool that is, I look at the objects and I think of I use the term gateway drug. You said something much tame. You want to show someone that $100 piece of paper so that they can start to understand printing, that one slip, the way it's cut, the way it's printed, docketing, all of these things that were done to it, were done to a lot of these things. And when I was, I think 11 or 12 years old, I was obsessed with The Twilight Zone. And it was on in New York at 1 in the morning, and it was on WGBH in Boston at 11 and 11:30. And every night on my VHS, I taped 3 episodes, kept a journal and a composition book of which ones I watched. I bought the Twilight Zone companion and filled in, and I was training myself to be able to look at all of this stuff. And there was no value in what I was doing except understanding that there were authors and directors and all the things that go with a television show. And now I'm learning about our history, whatever. I forgot everything I learned in school. I'm learning at it through the objects. So that idea of the, history through 50 objects or whatever. I love that because I think younger people today, they don't care about things the way older people. Let's just say under 30 and over 50. I'll be super broad. So I try and meet them where they live, put the thing in their hand and say, this is 500 years old. Here's a newspaper from, announcing a battle or announcing a ship or like you think you know about slavery, look at this ad on the back of this newspaper offering like this, strong boy of 11 years old or something that we now look at as being offensive and hideous, and it is, but it was in daily newspaper back then, just like now, like when the New York Times used to have those little things on the bottom of the front page, you can pay for a little message to someone. I guess they've stopped doing that a long time ago. But in 1770s is a very different thing. Long way of saying I like the idea of the gateway drug. When we go into homes, often when we're looking at stuff for auction, we're looking through a collection, and it'll be a great collection of campaign buttons or something that we really can't sell individually, but I try and use that as a tool to the people who haven't started yet. This is what you can do. This is how you can do it. This is what it can look like. Or to your man with the FDR books, you don't have to know anything about it. If it makes you happy to populate your world with stuff, whether it's your grandmother's china or I love walking. I've got a little G-Man gun on my keychain, which is like a Cracker Jack thing from the 30s that I bought 35 years ago at a book fair, stuck it on my keychain and never took it off. And every day I walk around with this thing that's now almost 100 years old, just makes me happier. I can look at the stamping, I can look at, G-Man, the founding of the FBI. There's so much to tell in the simplest objects. I think your example of the pay slip is better. But they are gateway drugs, so we can look at any one of these things and see, okay, that's important. And to your point, not everyone can spend $1 million or $100,000 or $10,000. Maybe they've got $40 or $200.
Yeah. I mean, to riff on what you were saying a bit, what I find with younger people, especially, they're all looking, we all heard this, they want experience. Well, to me, every single one of these objects is an experience, someone else's experience. And you're adding on to your own experiences, something you never could have had. So you're adding on experiences from the past, other people, and maybe they'll reverberate with yourself, but they'll certainly become part of you. And I've said as well with history, the study of history, for instance, with Mr. Lincoln, that I know enough from his birth until even today that I feel myself 216 years old now. I feel those are years added to my own. So I'm thinking of starting the Moses bookshop and feel 3,000 years old. What do you think?
That sounds great. I'll tell one story putting my museum hat on. So I always, it drove me crazy when I would go to museums as a kid and there'd be velvet ropes in front of everything. So thinking about that, we were trying to figure out a way to have people touch something original. And that's sort of verboten, especially in a museum that's going to have 1 million people through it, in its first 4 years or whatever. And but we got this big pile of original tulip poplar wood from the last surviving Liberty tree, which was struck by lightning in Annapolis in the 90s. But it was one of the gathering places of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty in the 1770s. And so we're trying to figure out what are we going to do with this. And we actually had in plans to construct this fabricated, scenic environment of a Liberty tree. And with lanterns on it, marking what happened when they repealed the Stamp Act. But we decided to put a piece of that original Liberty tree wood embedded in the tree with a sign next to it, explaining what it was and inviting people, particularly kids, to touch it. And this is I think part of the enthralling thing about it is being invited to touch something in a museum. But my former boss often told this story about walking down through the galleries one time, and he sees this group of Philadelphia school kids, maybe 9-year-old kids, And he hears one of them, and he's standing next to the Liberty Treatwood, and he goes to his friends, "You see that? Sam Adams touched that." And he went, boom! And they were, oh, it was like lightning, you know. And I mean, I don't think Sam Adams ever did touch the Annapolis Liberty, but the point was that he was connecting to the past, this immediate tactile connection that brought him directly in touch with it, literally. And I think that's why I turned to collecting, because of those velvet ropes. Then I went to antique shows, and you could handle this stuff. I often think of an antique show as a museum where you can touch things. And I think that messaging to parents and stuff, maybe not all dealers would like that, but I think that could help.
I describe what I do in exactly the same way. The auction world, our exhibitions, it's a museum where you can touch stuff, you're invited to touch stuff, and it's liberating. So quite close, I do.
See, I say you can not only touch it, you can buy it.
Even better. No, the three of you have touched on this already, but you you brought it up, that there's two stories being told with these objects. The thing you see, but also the backstory of how it got here into this room. We call this provenance. How does that story shape the historical and the market significance to that piece? I think Darren has a few examples of great things we've sold that were just objects, but without the story, they're just objects.
Right. And the story I like to tell, because it's the most absurd, we had this fantastic watercolor that we sold 18 months ago. It was a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette to George Washington. This picture of the destruction of the Bastille. It was basically saying, like, "You're my adopted father. I'm giving this to you. I'm showing you what we've done here in France and what I've been able to do in your tutelage." Great story. It hung in Mount Vernon. Impeccable provenance. But someone asked me about its artistic value. I said, well, it's a $200 watercolor with a $2 million story. Like, there's nothing spectacular about it. But it is that witness to history. It is the thing that it started life in France, where Lafayette instructed someone to draw a picture of that. I know I'm going to give it to. And then it took something like, was it Thomas Paine that helped get it to the States? So back when you could ask Thomas Paine to do something for you, he got it to the States, got it to Washington. That's an absurd example, but the item, it really was a $200 picture with a fantastic story. But I think also, when I started out in the trade, I remember an older bookseller. I was 26, I think he was 50, he was twice as old as me. And I was looking through my books or showing him my stock. And it was in an apartment on East 72nd Street. And he opened a book, and there was a signature in the front. And I noticed it, but I didn't really think about it. And it said, I think it was E something Newbold. Like, let's say E.M. Newbold, whatever. And he said, well, Edith Wharton's maiden name was Newbold, and it's an E. Let's find out what her middle name was. And my world exploded, and the whole idea of this thing is special because of what it is, but because of who it belonged to. I never could prove that one was right, but I spent 30 years finding other ones that were right. Sometimes it's a book plate, sometimes it's just handwriting. Recently, we had a book come in, and it had a book plate of some unremarkable name, and I said to Colin, my colleague behind you, I sold a book from this guy's library 25 years ago. I'll never forget a book plate. And I dug into it, spent half an hour. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot, there's nobody. But it just showed that his books survived. We knew where his house was. We knew what his family and his house meant in history, all from these little clues, in this case, provenance. Those are my two examples.
Provenance is great, and some pieces need provenance and others maybe don't. It's always nice to have, but if it's a Lincoln note, it's either a Lincoln note or it ain't. And if we don't know who had it before you're looking at it, it's still a Lincoln note, and it still has the story, and you can still do vertical history and find out why it exists. But something like a Appomattox Courthouse, table, which I've had twice. And that needed ironclad provenance, because otherwise it's just another table. So I think some need it, some in the middle, and some maybe don't.
Some things are just enhanced by it. I mean,
Positively enhanced.
yeah, well, like the map that's behind the audience here, the Skull and Heap 1759 Pennsylvania, you know, that's a beautiful map. It's a very important map in the history of cartography. But interestingly, the American Philosophical Society about 3 years ago bought a manuscript letter, I believe it was from Clement Biddle, writing from Nathaniel Greene's headquarters during the Valley Forge winter to his cousins who were relatives of Skull, saying, we cannot get enough copies of this map for the Army. It's an extremely important map for the Army to understand, you know, the landscape. Do you have the plate? We want to strike more of them. So it's rare then, first of all, during Valley Forge. Second of all, it's extremely useful. But third, talk about witness to history. I mean, one that survives has a very good chance of being laid out on a table during, you know, conversations about strategy and tactics by the Continental Army. So, I mean, something like that, to me, it just really radically changes something from a beautiful piece of art and science to, you know, a witness.
Now, I mean, similar to provenance adding value, especially in manuscript material, it's the content, right? And I know we have several items in our sales that usually it's just a letter from Jefferson, pointing somebody, but as the letter that we have that I'm in question is incredible content, and that just adds so much more value.
Yeah, well, sometimes like that Jefferson letter, it's like, he just keeps saying what you want him to say. It's like, oh, we have this, we're finalizing the treaty, there's independence now, it's for real. And by the way, I'm working on this book about Virginia, and don't worry about the previous manuscript copy circulating around, fixing it. I'd really like to hear from you about your thoughts on America, which this is to Chastellot, who's about to publish his travels in North America, which is partially a Revolutionary War memoir. And by the way, we've got all these rebellions going on. Don't worry about it. It's really just, about paying for the government, and we'll figure that out. And it's like, well, thank you, Jefferson. Did you have auction in mind when you wrote this? It's really just, sometimes you get something that's just sort of riddled with history. And
that's in the Eric Cairns sale on June 30th. Is there any for Lincoln? When it comes to content, since there's so much material out there, what types of things are collectors looking for?
Depends on the collector. It's across the board. There's so much. Lincoln, Indiana. Of course, there's also Civil War. You can't take one from the other, and it's just a huge plethora of material that people kept because it was the biggest thing they've ever done in their lives, and so. It's really a kind of across the board. I don't see that one is harmed over the other. There's always someone coming in looking for something I never thought they'd be looking for. I had it in my desk for years. All of a sudden, someone comes in and wants it because they're collecting that, whatever it might be.
Well, it's interesting with Lincoln. I mean, that's the one category that I've seen where collectors will buy a bust of Lincoln and a letter of Lincoln. I don't see that in collecting modern first editions or really any other category. Is that just because it's Abraham Lincoln? And that's
they're talking about a drug. They're just drugged.
Yeah.
And I was walking through an airport with a collector who has money, and we were a great collection. And we were walking along in the airport, coming from a symposium, and all of a sudden stopped, and that collector picked up a penny from the floor. I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I just can't stop myself."
Because Lincoln.
We love those.
Because Lincoln just could not stop getting something Lincoln. Frank Williams is another one, our friend Harold. he just couldn't stop himself. And I've known numbers of collectors who do that, and they build fabulous collections that way, or at least interesting collections that way. Because you have to have a little bit of everything to tell a story, and there's so many different stories. That fan, for instance, that was made in Cuba out of aluminum, which was a precious metal. And it was made in Cuba by a firm from Paris, and it was shown at the World's Fair in Paris in 1867. But that is technology, it's mourning culture, it's art, it's, in fact, women's defense, because one of them was made for the defense of a woman. It had a stiletto that came out of the blade when you pushed it up, and had a little place where you could secrete poison and maybe put it in someone's drink, and that was made for Central America. So something like that has so many different ways to get to one specific artifact.
That's a good segue to my final question, where it's, looking forward after this 250th anniversary. Are there certain areas that deserve more attention? Where do you see the collecting going? What's the next thing? Maybe we can, at least in the auction world, what are we seeing, Darren?
One of the funny things about putting an auction together is whether it's 100 lots or 500 lots, you have to start somewhere, and whatever that first item is, let's say it's a book sale, think, okay, so it's James Baldwin. Do I want to go some literary thing, or an American thing, or a post-war? And then you get the second book, like, oh, that's going to be different. Let's do this. And you build the sale, and then you sell the sale, and then you do that for however many years. You just start seeing what is popular and what isn't, because I can put the same 100 topics up every 4 months, and then over 8 years, I can watch the things that are rising, falling, and staying in the middle. I'd like to think we're pushing that, but I think because of the very nature of auction, you're only buying what you want. So I can't say that I'm influencing anything, or our sales are influencing, because people will pay what they want for what they want. And if they literally don't want something, they don't buy it. And those are called unsolds. And that is a dirty word in our world. But it's fascinating to see, because things that would have taken off 30 years ago, you can't sell now. Things that you couldn't sell 20 years ago, you can't get enough of now. And then I see this more with my youngest colleagues, people who are literally sort of coming out of college. They're finding value and interest in things that maybe all 4 of us have totally ignored, and they're not wrong. They just aren't freighted with what we're freighted with. So they see something with this sort of like these virgin eyes, and I love that, because I think, well, hard work that we do and are different in similar ways is going to be passed on, maybe not the way we thought it was, but by someone who just thinks, this is the greatest thing ever, this is what I'm going to collect. And we have history in common, and we have stuff in common, but I love to see it just going to take off, or it's going to go where it goes. So I could find themes and report on them in a spreadsheet, but it's more interesting to just see. I go to a book fair, and I see more and more of something. I look at auction catalogs from all different houses, and I see more and more of some things and less of another. And I think it's just organic. We can try and push it, but we're not in charge.
So in a way, it's happenstance as well.
Yeah, I think very much. Yeah.
Maybe Netflix, books into shows.
Well, in one respect, I think the big open question is the effects of the international market, and that's got lots of layers to it. But for the past 10, 15 years, say World War II items have been surging past Revolutionary War and Civil War items. And talking to a friend and colleague who collects all those areas, he said, the answer is obvious. He said, it was a world war. So everyone in the world knows people who are collecting it. And he says, it doesn't matter what's happening to the U.S. economy. Someone, somewhere in the world has money, and they're interested. There's some people there collecting World War II. The Revolutionary War, he says, forget it, it's so provincial. That's a big trend, I think, and change that we may be seeing. And I think the Revolution and Lincoln will remain a stable force, but I think some of these international histories and connections may rise. I mean, I think, for example, a lot of 16th century books are just, oh God, this is a medieval thing, and it's no money, compared to a lot of other things. And so I think that sort of dynamic may be changing our culture.
I've said that about manuscripts too. When I think of the art market, and I think of the best letters, maybe the Gettysburg Address would get up there, but there's art that goes for $50 million. Well, why doesn't a great letter of whomever, Washington, Lincoln, whomever, go at least, closer to that than not? It has great content. It tells us about something. Art is great, it's beautiful, we enjoy it, feeds our souls again, but here is the human endeavor, the human differences that are in these letters, and they don't seem, to me, to carry as much weight as second-rate impressionism.
I wonder if you think it has something to do with the way the very earnestness of our fields is a barrier, which is to say, there's a great quote from George Frederickson, the great historian of the Civil War, wrote, I think it was the late 60s, wrote a book called The Inner Civil War, an intellectual history of the conflict. And he said that the reason why Americans love the Civil War better than the Revolutionary War is because the Civil War gives Americans a claim of being exceptional without attaching a claim of exceptional virtue. Whereas the Revolution has that attachment. Those things are heavy. Having those in your home and telling your friends about them, it's heavy stuff. And are you taking on some sort of mantle of those august personages of that past? And whereas a piece of art, especially I think often modern art, it's a little bit less. It's more open to interpretation, and I think that might be an appeal. I'm not sure. It's very. What do you think?
I don't.
Okay.
Actually, along those lines, the word that comes to me is relatability. A tri-corner hat is never going to look cool to me or normal. Even there's the Courier Ives print of Lincoln and Washington in the next room. It's the one we've named the sail after. It's called The Father and the Savior. And they're both in it, and of course they're 100 years apart. And Washington still looks like he's in fancy dress. He looks like he's dressed up as a colonial figure. Lincoln's in modern clothes. The World War II analogy, I think, is Brink, because you have some connection in your family. If it wasn't a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt, it was a neighbor, or it was the school you went to that was named after. It's not that far to go back and connect those things. And I remember being a very small kid in the early 70s, which seems both a long time ago and not at all, where in the early 70s, there was World War I veterans at every street corner. Now they're all gone. And just think that withered old guy did this thing at the time 50 years ago, which is now over 100 years ago. The younger people are relating to stuff that they can relate to just like we did. And I think we just keep sort of replacing that. And as you said about the 16th century, 17th century books that you can get for $100, as you can spend more in Starbucks than something that will be gone in 8 hours. Yeah. But a book that survived the Great Fire of London or any of these things, it boggles my mind. But of course, it's our job to hold those things up and say that there's value. If it's not dollars and cents, there's value.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for that. Before we go into Q&A, I invite you to see all these objects and enjoy them up and close.
So with that,
does anyone have any questions for panelists?
Just in terms of what we were just talking about, in terms of modern abstract art, so 50 million as opposed to the fabulous letter with great content. I'm wondering if what your thoughts are, whether part of it is that art is very visual. Not to say that a great letter isn't visual, but it's visual, and that art is being treated more almost as a commodity nowadays that can be traded, where I think history and letters and manuscripts and even modern literature, it's more of a personal thing. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
History takes some knowledge, some curiosity, whereas we're a visual society. You're bombarded every single moment. Look at this room. Great stuff in here. It takes the eye from one to the other. And visually, we adapt to it and love it. We know it from screen. We know it from our own photographs. We know it from our homes that have things in it. It's visual. And yes, it can be very visual. Look at a Zachary Taylor letter or an Edmund Stanton letter. They're great visual letters. But then you have to know where Stanton is or what the hell he's writing about. And you're right, you can form any opinion as we see on the internet all the time. For anything, you get your own opinion, look at a piece of art, and if you like it, there it is.
Well, I hope it never gets that commoditized, because I'll never be able to afford it then. But also, I like the personal quality of it. I think there have been some efforts, some successful, to commoditize it. The broadside of the Constitution that attracted bidding from, sort of a conglomerate, and drove that price sky high in levels that really we haven't seen in our field. That may be a harbinger of future times. I think one of the challenges it's a challenge for art too, so I don't exactly know how art compares with this. I'm not an expert in art, but the subjectivity of these items makes them hard to commoditize, and their uniqueness too. Often, especially with three-dimensional items where it doesn't say on it its date or whatever, if something's unique, it's actually terrible for its value, because you have no comparable. You can't figure it out. So art, often the art that is, Campbell's soup cans, those are much more commoditizable. They were intended to be. And so I think that, there's a variation in the spectrum of the art market as well within that. But I think that's a key dynamic for sure. And I don't know that most of this stuff can be commoditized in the same way. Yeah, I agree.
Sorry, I was just going to say one more thing about that. And I don't think Freeman's is guilty of this. And I say guilty, it's nothing wrong with it. But some of these crazy prices are for things that are showing up in art auctions or evening auctions of multiple things and appear to be being treated as trophies. So you can spend $43 million on an American foundational document or on a painting, and it's no longer a foundational document. It's a bison head up on the wall, or a unicorn, or it's a bad example.
A banana, maybe?
A banana. There's nothing wrong with buying and selling that way, but it takes it out of the realm of what we do, and it becomes a story, almost like the $2 million Bastille with the $200 picture, the $2 million story. You buy something for $43 million, you've destroyed the market for that thing, but you've got a story to tell, and you're also the one. It's like the whoever has the most toys wins mentality, and I think that it invades our world. Our world is not made up of that, but occasionally it sort of comes into it, and we see these amazing things. Like not so long ago, you could buy a document like that for $8 million or $10 million, and now the sky is the limit.
Those were the days,
Exactly. I stopped buying.
Yeah, I said $8 million, I was out.
Anyway, enough on that.
Yeah.
But sorry, you had a question.
Yeah. Going to something like the Declaration of Independence, can you just give us, whoever one of you or all of you would be appropriate expert on this, there seem to be a lot of copies. Can you just kind of walk through the hierarchy of why one would get 42 million, another sell in the 6 digits, and other examples sell in the 7? Do some have all the original signatures? Do some only have a few signatures? What kind of creates that hierarchy when it comes to an incredibly important historical document like the Declaration?
All right. I'll do my best. So the proximity to July 4th, 1776 is a big factor. So the Dunlap printings are the July 4th, 1776 broadside printings. There's 28 known in the world. Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin and Sherman, as members of the Committee of Five, Livingston had gone, went to Dunlap down the street and stood over his shoulder while he set the type. I often tell the joke, it's like the mechanic who says that he'll do your cards $5 an hour, but 10 if you watch. You imagine those guys. It's like, no, it was a comma. No, we didn't say it was a comma. Look at Thompson's. So that is, has a supremacy perhaps because of that. Then there's there's I think a preference for broadside, which is, generally one-sided. It's large. It's more like a piece of art over a newspaper. But then you have crossing with that is how soon after the Declaration is the newspaper. So, the Pennsylvania Evening Post first newspaper printing is probably more valuable than most broadsides because it's done within days of July 4th. There's the first several months of newspaper printings are really how the country learned about the Declaration of Independence, because the engrossed version that's on display at the National Archives had to be created over a couple of months. So it wasn't until August 2nd that most of the signers signed it. Meanwhile, they're printing newspapers and broadsides all through July. And so that there have been a lot of dealers who've tried to bring awareness of that, and museum people to increase the importance of those earlier newspaper and broadside printings. Now, within the family of newspaper and broadside printings, there are some outliers that are later that are more important than some of their predecessors because of their being firsts in other ways. Mary Catherine Goddard of Maryland in 1777 was appointed, paid by the Continental Congress to print the second official copy, the Dunlap being the first. And by then, it was a unanimous declaration. On the Dunlap, they couldn't say that because New York hadn't met to agree to adopt it until the 9th of July. But so that's that's the first official copy that says unanimous declaration. It's also the first one that had the signers' names at the bottom. And it was printed by a woman, which is a whole other intriguing story. So that's considered a superior example. And then another example is you would think that most 19th century examples would be worth far less than any 18th century examples, but the stone engraving from the very beginning of the 1820s is more valuable than most broadside printings from 1776 and because of the way it was made. In that case, what happened was John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State in 1818, was concerned that the engrossed version, which was the formal accepted version, still has legal implications now, what the grammar was in it. He was concerned that it was fading and it was on vellum and it was not going to be available to future generations. So he had stone down in Maryland engrave the entire thing and he gave him the original. Congress gave him the original. He had it in his shop for like 3 years. Can you imagine? What's that? You're talking about Washington's mail. I mean, he's got the Declaration on his desk because he has to do it so precisely. He did so well that the legend became he had some sort of acidic process of transferring the image, and that's in fact why the original is so bad. But that's not the case. He was the attempt at a solution to that. He wasn't the problem. So those versions are actually what are now used to reproduce the Declaration. So when you buy at the National Park Service a version of the engrossed copy of the Declaration, it's Stone's engraving that it's made from, not the engrossed version in the National Archives, because that one's just too far gone. That kind of, and they made 200 of them, and they disseminated them to the governors and to different international, to the surviving signers. So that has a sort of value that is surprising within the general scheme of value. So that's kind of a basic.
Will you be writing a book about this?
I know there's quite a few books about it. And I'll plug my co-curator in this exhibit that we did at the Museum of the American Revolution, The Declaration's Journey, Emily Sneff. She's just published a book called When the Declaration Was News, and it's about the first 8 months after independence and where it spread and how. And it's got all kinds of interesting new revelations about these printings.
One thing I want to throw in, Freeman's has been lucky enough to sell 2 of the stone engravings. So we did a lot of homework. And one thing that, I don't know if Phil left it out or not, but like they say about Ginger Rogers, she was as good as Fred Astaire. She did all the same things, but backwards. That was engraved backwards. So it took him 3 years looking at the original to copy the entire thing backwards. And if you look at them side by side, it's uncanny, including copying all the signatures. So all of that is completely man-made with a tool on an engraving plate backwards, and yet it looks absolutely perfect. So I don't think that's what adds to its value, but it blows most people's minds to think that's how it came to be.
I should correct something, though. I said they're more valuable. They're probably equivalent in value to the broadsides of 76. Yours, one of the ones that you sold was Charles Carroll's copy, which we had on display at the museum in the American Revolution for a while. That one was fantastic because, first of all, he's the only Catholic signer. And he wrote over here in a little presentation, he said, it August 2nd, 1826, presented to my friend, I can't remember who now, and signed 50 years to the day when I signed the original, which is part of how we know when he signed it. You know, I mean, that's just pretty cool. They really were trying to create a memory themselves of their own events.
And Lauren, I'll make it super quick. When this copy of Charles Carroll's stone engraving came to us, we learned that there was 3 signers alive in 1823, and it was Jefferson, Adams, and Carroll. All of them were ancient. Carroll was in his 90s. And each of the signers were given 2. And Adams's are both, I think, at the Athenaeum or some Massachusetts Historical Society. Jefferson's are unknown, they're lost. And Charles Carroll's, one of them was at the Baltimore Museum, which is, I think, Baltimore History Museum, and then this one. So my colleague Colin Foley and I got to our car. Our stone was in my briefcase because it was folded up into a sort of roughly 11 by 14. It was a piece of vellum. It came to us that way, just in its original fold. And 2 curators met us. This was during COVID. And the 4 of us were standing in this beautiful room, and on the table was our stone engraving that belonged to Carroll with his handwriting, and next to it was their stone engraving of Carroll's with his handwriting on it. And the 4 of us just sort of looked, I shed a tear. It was the strangest, most beautiful moment because these things had been reunited 45 years later. Or no, sorry, 1820s, 200 years later. But it was very powerful because both of them belonged to this guy. He also owned 1,000 slaves. He was a terrible person, but he was the last surviving signer. He was, to your point, so there was 3 signers. He was the last one. He was the oldest and the last one. And here they were next to each other. And then we took it away and we sold it. And as Phil said, it's been on display at the museum. They came back together for 15 minutes in 2021 after being apart since 1823. We took photos of them on the table, and they were just beautifully stretched and had been looked after for ages. And what was remarkable about ours was it just had 4 folds in it, so we almost think it must have been the spare. Like they folded the whole thing once in half, and then one more time, and that was the thing I put in a briefcase because that was the sort of the safest way to do it. Anyway, just one of the fun things that we all get to do.
Don't you love your job, Darren?
Totally love my job.
They pay us to have fun.
So we speak Phil.
Yeah.
Gerard, you saw something they didn't.
Thank you. Yes, that's the other half of it. You're right. Well, we don't know what stone, what he did at night, but yeah.
Any questions for Abraham Lincoln?
Or his representative.
Yes, yes.
Well, I'll say this, I shouldn't say this here because of what this represents, one of these auctions coming up with Washington and Lincoln. I don't know, I was thinking about that, and all of a sudden I said, well, I joke around a lot with people and say there's a reason why there's no Millard Fillmore bookshop. And
Yeah.
now, yeah, never. So I was thinking about this with Washington. There's also no George Washington bookshop. So Mr. Lincoln is a little different than anyone, I suppose. Maybe Churchill, there's a Churchill bookshop. But even though there are many, many of you know better than I how many prints of Washington there was in the first part of that century, and then it started to meld with Lincoln. Lincoln has been speaking of Washington and alluding to him for years, and then of course the assassination, they were put together, the father and the preserver, or the father and savior. Numerous prints were put out like that. But then, after a while, you don't see Washington as much. But today it's still happening. Still seeing tons of Lincoln coming up. So in a way, he's almost taken over some of the revolution, certainly the Declaration of Independence. I almost say that he helped make this sale coming up.
Well, I mean, Lincoln, a lot of historians today argue, revitalized the Declaration of Independence. He loved the Declaration. One of the things we have on display in this exhibit, The Declaration's Journey, I keep pointing to Ira because he's got a copy of the catalog in his briefcase there, is a book that, a sort of scrapbook that Lincoln carried in his debates with Stephen Douglas, and it was, he glued in favorite political passages, and the first thing in it is the Declaration of Independence. He said he had no, moral political principle that didn't proceed from the Declaration, and he also was the paraphrasing, he also was he really brought the statement about equality and rights into the fore to the wide American public. Abolitionists have been doing this for a long time, but as well as working movement, persons movements and stuff, but in the debate with Douglas, he said, that is the piece that Jefferson put in for future use. And he said, without that, this is just spent wadding on an old battlefield. And so it's Lincoln who is kind of, I think in a way it's like he is the slingshot effect, if you know how they use gravity around planets to move space equipment. He's the slingshot effect on the Declaration. The Revolution set it in motion, but he's turning it and keeping it going with those statements. Do you agree?
Positive.
Okay.
Well, thank you, and we want to invite you all to see these objects, grab a drink, talk to one of our specialists, panel experts. We'd love to talk more about this. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.